Here at the Independence Reformed Bible Church, we do allow for questions following the sermon. Who has the first question this morning? Yes.
By the way, the mic will pick up your voice.
So, when IRBC first started, you taught through this. And I have a little note in my Bible on that 10-day thing that the time would be limited. And I just want you to comment on that. Is that something we can take from that?
Yeah.
It's
not an indefinite. It's a definite time. It's not an indefinite time. And yeah, even though scholars were all over the place on exactly what it meant, they really pretty much all came down, the ones I read anyway, on that point. It's a definite time. And they would say that, and then they go into what is the 10, this kind of. Actually a couple of them went into a thing of, they said it was like 240 years, a 240-year period of persecution, and somehow they did a 10 thing and got to the 240 thing. And I read it, I don't even know how they did it. Sounded kind of like Harold Camping to me, but I couldn't quite get that. But yeah,
there would have been some security in having.
It's not going to go on forever.
Right.
Yeah. There's a definite beginning.
You're about to suffer. So with a definite beginning, he gives them a definite end. I just don't know what that is. I don't think it's 240 years. I don't think it's 10 persecutions. I think it has nothing to do with Constantine. But you'd be surprised how many scholars threw that out there. I just don't think it had anything to do with that. I truly don't. Yes, Ryan.
In your book there, which is very interesting at the end, describing a literal war with guns that she was hoping to hear.
Right. In the beginning, there were no guns.
Right.
But I'll talk about that in a minute. I want to hear your question.
So you transition from that, which I think insinuates it would be good for someone to come in and rescue and stop this genocide with guns. That might be the bad one, or definitely be feeling that would be a good thing. Then you went on to talk about Christians being at war. What does that war look like?
Yeah.
The war that we see in the book of Acts was a war of sovereignty, if you will. And we see it happening later on with the Romans. When we, engage in this, Paul saying the weapons of warfare are not carnal, but mighty, the pulling down of strongholds. That's what it looks like, at least in the beginning. And you might say, is it a war of words? Well, it is. It starts with a war of words, if you will. It just doesn't necessarily end there. For example, everywhere where Paul went, it started with words. It usually ended with somebody, as we said before, getting hurt. And Paul seemed never went anywhere where somebody didn't get hurt at some point. So it certainly starts with that. The claim of sovereignty by Christ is what is the most offensive thing. And that is what was, as we said, I think it was a week or two ago, when we talk about the Romans and how much they hated the Christians just because they wouldn't sacrifice to the genius of the emperor, and the Romans couldn't understand it because they said, we'll let Christ be a god too. Why can't you people just get along with us? Everybody else gets along with us. We have Isis worship, we have Sybil worship, we have Zeus worship, Thor worship, we got everything. Why can't you just get along with us? And the problem was one of sovereignty. The Christians said, no, we actually can't give worship to anyone else. There's really only one God. I believe we have the same problem today. The issues we get into over creation and this kind of stuff, and over science and evolution and all that, education, it's a question of who gets to be sovereign. And I believe that's where it starts. That's not where it ends, but that's definitely where it starts. And I think it does start, and it does look like a war of words, just like it did with Christ. John 8 started with words, ends up with stones. His ministry starts with repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, starts with words, ends with crucifixion for him. Do you want to ask a follow-up question about that?
I think that's, just to be clear what kind of war we're running into. And I guess it is interesting, of the examples you gave, it seemed like the Christians were always the ones getting hurt physically.
Yeah.
At least that is in these examples.
Yeah.
Well, even in this, the Rwandan genocide, if you don't know too much about it, not to get into it too much, but there were so-called Christians on both sides of that. A lot of them were really nominal Christians that went to church and then lived however, and it wasn't that hard. It was not that hard for the Tutsi or the Hutus, for their pastors to fire up their parishioners to go out and kill the Tutsis. It wasn't that hard. And I argue we have a similar problem today. We teach generalities of being a nice Christian. We don't teach the specifics of God's requirements through his law word. If they would have been taught the specifics of his requirements, I don't think that would have ever happened. But they weren't. And I've read about what they were taught. Generalities, platitudes, love, love without any specifics doesn't mean anything. It's a useless term, quite frankly, without the specifics. Who else has a question? Yeah.
Could you comment on the Crusades as an example or not an example of the kind of war you're talking about?
Yeah, at the end of the War of Words, right? The Crusades. Yeah. Boy, that's a tough one. I generally am a defender of the Crusades. Most historians were up until 50 years ago, quite frankly. Have you ever noticed how many, even today's schools, still have as their mascot a crusader? Ever notice that one? A lot of them still do. It was a good thing up until a few years ago. I defend the Crusades as a defensive war and an act of love for one's neighbor. How can I do that? Well, if you were in the bathroom, you would want somebody to come and rescue you, right? How about if you were a Christian? And remember, the Middle East was a Christian area up until the 6th century AD. It was Christianized. Then we had that little problem called Islam, which came along. And let's be honest, Islam is pretty much spread by the sword. It's not spread with words. It's spread at the edge of a sword. And they started killing people. And they kept killing people. And it spread out to even Jerusalem. And so there were those of at least Christian heritage. Some of the stuff that goes on that crusade, I don't know. Was it Pope Leo handing out absolution? Anybody that goes on a crusade gets all their sins forgiven? Where do you get that from? Wow. But the motivation was defending their neighbors. That was the motivation. And for 200 years they did. A lot of us aren't aware that Jerusalem had peace for 188 years. And then Jerusalem failed again. They got the Crusades going again. The Crusades went over an awful long period of time. But I believe it was an act of love for their neighbor, defending their neighbor. And anybody who says it was an offensive war, I ask this question. When did the Crusaders ever turn on the Islamic sacred cities? Mecca and Medina, right? If this was an offensive war, once they secured Jerusalem, they would have consolidated their gains, and they would have headed right down to Mecca if this was an offensive war. And it wasn't that. I've asked myself a question. If they would have consolidated Jerusalem and headed down to Mecca and solved that problem, would that have been a bad thing? Who has the next question? That's how I see those. That's how I see it. And you have all these historians saying they were offensive wars. They were offensive wars. They would never even gone to Jerusalem. They're just going straight to Mecca and Medina. Who else has a question? Well, thank you for your kind attention as we study these churches in Revelation.